First of all, welcome to everyone on the line. We have an exceptionally large turnout for the webinar today. People from all segments of the pharma ecosystem, from pharma companies to suppliers and service providers, including globally. So again, we very much appreciate you setting time aside. My name is Mitch Collins. I'm the Chief Revenue Officer for Adaptive Clinical Systems, responsible for sales and business development. Before I introduce our two presenters today, just to let you know, there, as you see on your screen, or you should see, there's a chat box. If you have questions, please submit them. We'll try to get to questions at the end. We may not have time because we have a very full agenda. If we don't answer you today, or if you would prefer to submit a question privately, there will be information at the end of the presentation with contact information. And again, we'll get back to you right away, set up a time to speak, and answer you in as much depth as we can. And now I'd like to introduce our two presenters, starting with Sina Adibi. Sina is the founder and chief executive officer of Adaptive Clinical Systems. Sina is a technology leader with many years of experience building technology frameworks to enable clinical trial data interoperability. He has a wealth of experience. Prior to founding Adaptive Clinical Systems, he was the chief technology officer of ParXL, and he's had leadership experiences in other companies as well, as you can see on the screen. He is a recognized thought leader and is a member of a number of industry task forces and associations. Perhaps most notably, he is on the FDA eSource task force, which he was invited to join. In addition to Sina, joining us today is Nithya Ananthakrishnan. Nithya is the chief executive officer and founder of Algorix. Algorix is a firm focused on building a strength on data analytics, focusing on data visualization, centralized monitoring, and as you'll see today, a specific emphasis on risk management, which we'll be talking about. Much like Sina, he has a deep and broad experience base, including the leadership role at ICON, and he is also a member of a number of industry associations and has other interests as well. We are a partner with Algorix. We work closely with them. And I think you'll have a very informative presentation today. And again, we'll be happy to take questions at the end. And with that, I'll turn the presentation over to Nithya.
Thank you, Mitch. Good afternoon, everyone. It's been a pleasure to meet you all in this webinar. I'm going to focus on the agenda. So today we are going to focus on the 4 key components that helps us to achieve compliance with ICH E6R2, the recent addendum. And the agenda for this session will be, I'll focus on the regulatory guidelines which impact risk management and monitoring, and we will also share the challenges that our customers have faced in individual phases and how we help them in overcoming that. And the second half of the session will be continued by Sina, where he can walk you through about how their eClinical bus, which helps in data aggregation and interoperability, can build efficiency around the risk management process. And he'll also highlight about the advantages of having an integrated workflow. Right. So before I go further, we did a quick survey to understand the attendees on their understanding of the ICH E6 guidelines and the addendum. Some of you have mentioned that you are fairly new to this, so I thought it's good to add a history at the beginning. So everybody who is working in the clinical industry must have undergone some kind of training with good clinical practices. But the ICH E6 guidelines have now undergone a change almost after 20 years. So we're talking about 1997 versus 2017. And a lot of things have changed between now and then. Back in the days, it was all paper trials or even old methods of capturing the data in different formats. And now we are talking about mobile based data capture or directly integrating with EMR systems and all of that. So there's quite a bit of change in the technology, but how are we making changes to the process is what these addendum highlight. And even though there were different sections that are included in as part of this addendum, I'm going to focus on the quality management section and specifically a risk-based approach to the quality management. And you can see on the left the topics that talks about all the way from identifying critical process, data, and risk to taking through the entire cycle of how do we evaluate, control, review, and report. And along with this change, there has also been continuous endorsement from the regulatory bodies like US FDA, EMA, and even the Transliterate Consortium. They've been adding guidances over the past few years, and the addendum has come out very recently on top of this. So all this regulatory endorsement and push talks about a big emphasis on the risk-based approach, which means this is going to be a must-have in your clinical trials, in your future clinical trials, and not a nice-to-have kind of a solution. Right. So if an organization has to truly enable compliance towards this ICH E6R2, especially in the area of risk-based approach to quality management, they need to consider several areas that are elaborated in section 5. And for the ease of viewers, I have highlighted the different points that we will be covering in today's session. And it includes mainly 4 components or 4 broad areas of doing risk planning at the beginning of the protocol, and then tying those risks into data points and trying to analyze those data points using insights, which will then enable continuous risk review and risk control, and how we translate those insights into decisions and actions. That will complete the full data chain of taking the data all the way into insights and decisions and actions. And this is where all the 4 sections also highlight several points with respect to this risk management area. Now let's look at the first point on risk identification. So this comes at the beginning, and even before this, there is a point about critical data and process, but I thought we can combine both and talk here. So at the top, you will see a snippet from the actual addendum, and then I'm trying to explain that in an easier manner within the limited time that we have. So if you look at the risk identification as a step, this is now a new activity that needs to be performed along with the protocol development. And so whenever you're developing a protocol, you will need to also factor in some amount of time for identifying the critical data and the critical process throughout this protocol. And they need to be considered at 2 levels. One is at a system level, another one is at the clinical trial level. I mean, let me give you an example. Let's say we are going to run a cardiovascular trial. And of course, cardiovascular trial means large number of sites, large number of patients. So whenever you have a lot of sites, there's a definite possibility for each country or each site doing things on their own way, even though we have a protocol. So there is a higher chance of deviation in what they could do as a process that is supposed to be followed in the protocol. And cardiovascular trials also has an increased chance for hospital admissions and serious adverse events related to cardiac endpoints. So that could be something on a clinical trial level. So at a broad process level, when you can able to see these 2 areas, now if you break that down into a critical data point or a key risk indicator, it could end up measuring protocol deviation at sites, and as well as measuring serious adverse events that are treatment related. So it's essentially brainstorming what all possible things that can go wrong or that the team has seen in the past. It could be recruitment issues. It could be something related to patient loss to follow up. But we need to identify based on the cross-functional experience and then tie them to a key risk indicator. When you're able to do this as part of the risk identification, this is going to have an impact on how do you monitor the sites on an ongoing basis. So once we have determined what are all the potential risks that can occur in the trial based on the system level as well as the trial design level, then the next job is to score those risks. So how do we score them? Again, there are certain guidelines available in Transcelerate, and certain pharma companies use their own methodology. But the methodology that is proposed by Transcelerate is taken from the manufacturing industry best practices. There is a philosophy of quality by design, and based on that approach, we look at 3 parameters whenever you're considering a risk or a hazard, and that will be what is the impact of the risk, what is the probability of the risk, and what is the detectability of the risk. So going back to our same example, the protocol deviation at a site level is something, it could have a high impact. The probability could also vary depending on the maturity of the sites. And the detectability is a little tricky here, because if the site does something by mistake and they announce it back to the sponsor, then it is easy to detect. If the site does something and they themselves don't know that it is deviation, it's up to the monitor to find it. And so detectability can vary. Again, it's a very subjective element. Whereas an adverse event, a cardiac adverse event, is something that is easy to detect, has a high impact, and the probability depends on the patient population and the type of dose that is being administered and so on. So whatever it is, once you identify those key and critical paths, you need to score them in a consistent manner. The scoring has to be free from bias, meaning some folks might tend to put everything as medium. Some folks might keep an extreme rating like high and low. So it's better that you do a consistent way to all those protocol level risks as a cross-functional exercise. And then once it is done, it is not bad to set up risk review meetings during the protocol conduct phase to reevaluate if the scoring does not match with the reality. Now, having talked about risk identification and risk evaluation, I will share some of the challenges that companies face in these 2 areas. So there is a widely available material from Transcelerate consortium website. If you Google Transcelerate RBM assets, you will get a link which has got a download link to all these different documents and templates. So Transcelerate calls this as RACT. It's called the Risk Assessment and the Categorization Tool. It's a spreadsheet. But again, one of the things that I wanted to highlight is when pharma companies started doing these exercise using spreadsheets, for once, it is a cross-functional collaborative exercise, which means there are different stakeholders involved. So it has got all the demerits of dealing with a spreadsheet. You will not be able to control multiple versions. You won't be able to maintain an audit trail of the changes being made if you want to look back during the protocol conduct phase. And the data entry validation is again a question mark. It could be in the name of reusing a library of risks, there could be copy paste errors if it is not reviewed properly. And when you are working on multiple protocols or a team which is located virtually, there could be a lot of different information sitting in silos. So this is one of the area where our Acuity helps in terms of making it web-based and removing all these challenges of a conventional spreadsheet in a risk planning exercise. We'll go to the next phase about how do we do risk control. So once the sponsor identifies all the risks that they have analyzed for the protocol, depending on different categories, and whether it is a system level risk or protocol level risk, the next ideal thing is to do a mitigation. So again, the scenarios could be different for each risk. There could be a best case scenario, there could be an optimal scenario, and there could be a worst case scenario. Now, this is where we get into the risk control, where we are putting in systemic safeguard measures to defend these risks at some point, and also make sure that there is a certain department who is responsible for mitigating this risk. And if it is a key risk, then again, it needs to be mapped to some kind of a data element. So again, this is one of the advantage that our tool provides, where you not only add the scenario and mitigation, but you can tie it with the key risk indicator, which is in turn mapped to a dashboard. So this is going with a different approach. Conventionally, we have seen organizations develop hundreds of dashboards, but they never know when to use which dashboard or when to look at those email alerts. And most of the cases, it turns out to be a noise rather than signal. But by mapping, this is again a best practice that I would recommend for anybody who is implementing RBM, where you should look at the risk, map it to a scenario, map it to a mitigation, and then if it is a key risk, then you should also map it to the key risk indicator, which in turn ties up with the dashboard and an alert. That way, if a risk occurs, you know where to go and look for, and you're also alerted through an email in your inbox. So that's about risk control. And the next topic will be on the risk review. And before I get into risk review, I wanted to highlight section 5.18.3. Here, if you see, there is a heavy recommendation on usage of statistical analysis. Conventionally, we are all known to doing statistical analysis from the biostatistics department point of view, where they run tables, listings, and figures, and create create a submission document and all of that for regulatory submission. But now, as per this guideline, they also recommend these statistical analysis to look for missing data or inconsistent data or outliers, patterns, and so on. So that, in terms of applying it to a continuous process of monitoring the data proactively, changes the way sponsors or CRO should conduct the difference between on-site monitoring and centralized monitoring. So we'll go to that in a bit, but if you have to do this kind of analysis of data, it is not just EDC data, because with the biostatistics department, which has been conventionally running tables, listings, and figures, they are talking about EDC data only there. But when it comes to monitoring, if any of you are from ClinOps, you will agree, you have got a lot more challenges to deal in addition to EDC. You look at lab samples, you look at imaging data, you look at supply chain consistency, and all of that. So we need to apply the same amount of analysis, not only for EDC, but also on other systems that you are dealing with the protocol. All right, so if you have to deal with those different systems and you need to be able to aggregate the data, then there are three different phases that are involved in the data value chain. It's about discovering those different data elements in terms of the inventory and semantics, and integrating those different data elements, and also bringing them back into exploration and data visualization. So that's where a joint collaboration of adaptive and algorithms could work really well, where adaptive are experts in dealing with data aggregation and interoperability, and we focus on data visualization and statistical analysis and predictive models. So once we are able to do that, we will be able to do a continuous review of risks. So, and that's where the risk review comes in place. So here on the slide, you see a dashboard that has got overall adverse event by site. So essentially, these kind of dashboards that is real time and that comes up on a regular basis helps in many areas for the clinical operations team. One, it improves the focus on site monitoring. Two, you are able to proactively identify issues than discovering surprises. And you are then able to make a data-driven decision on whether you want to delay your monitoring visit or advance the monitoring visit depending on how the site is performing. And it is a continuous monitoring because the data is pulled every day and you're looking at signals are getting alerted on a regular basis. It's a continuous monitoring rather than a periodic checkup that is like once in 2 months. And whenever you're dealing with statistical analysis of data, you're dealing with 100% sample of the data rather than looking at only partial case report forms of a subject at a site. So all in all, it helps in doing the risk review in a more periodic manner, also ensure the control measures are put in place to remain effective and relevant. And once we have done the risk review, it goes to risk communication. This is again an area where the cross-functional department needs to play a major role. If you remember when I mentioned about mapping a risk with a scenario and a mitigation, I said we also define accountability of who is going to own which types of risk and what types of mitigation. So this is again a Translate based recommendation. They've come up with a phrase called IQRMP, which is nothing but integrated quality risk management plan. It takes into consideration the different stakeholders or the functional leads in each department and what is that they own as part of the risk mitigation for some of the cross-functional risks that is agreed upon at the beginning of the trial. So whenever they do a risk review meeting as a part of their continuous risk management exercise, they can look at whether a risk has occurred or it's just a noise that we are watching right now. And then they can also see how the dashboard is helping them to review or control the risk, and are the alerts giving them enough signals on the occurrences of the risks. So this again has to be a continuous cross-functional exercise. It could be like an interim cross-functional team meeting where they also review the risks on a regular basis and collaborate it as a cross-functional department exercise. Now the final point is the risk reporting. Now we talked about risk identification and evaluation and so on, but these all does not make any sense unless all those issues identified are converted into actions. And whenever there is an issue that occurs or a deviation that occurs from a predefined tolerance limit level, it calls for a risk reporting. And as part of the risk reporting, we document the root cause, the corrective and the preventive action. And above all, there also has to be a timely closeout of when this issue was raised and when it was closed and who closed it. So having an integrated workflow within the same platform and being able to communicate issues back into EDC or CTMS is important, so they can be tracked in a validated environment and not as email conversations or a spreadsheet again that has got an issue log kind of a system, but so that you have a validated system. So even if there is a regulatory submission in future, you can defend a regulatory audit by saying this is how we manage the risks and this is how all the risks were reported, and here is the root cause, corrective and preventive action and so on. So I hope you found the risk management, entire risk-based approach to the quality management module helpful. I'd be happy to take up any questions if you have post the webinar. Feel free to use the chat window or send the questions to the organizer. I now hand over back to Mitch and Sina for them to take over and focus on the aggregation and interoperability. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Nithya. We'll now turn the presentation over to Sina Adimi, the Chief Executive Officer of Adaptive Clinical Systems.
Okay, great. Thank you very much, Nithya, and thank you, Mitch. What I'd like to do is I'd like to spend the next few minutes go over some of the challenges and to propose a set of guidelines for everyone to consider when it comes to getting the data together for risk analysis. Now, Nitya did a great job of explaining the requirements, and once the data is in one place, what needs to get done with it. So, but now the first challenge that a lot of us face is, okay, where do we get the data from and where does it come from? How do we get it together in a consistent fashion? So a phrase that I'd like to introduce here is I'd like to talk about interoperability versus integration. Integration is something that we have been doing for many years. We have been, ever since we all started and ever beginning of EDC, we have been extracting data, massaging it in third-party tools like Excel and so on, and then loading it into a target system. However, now with the advent of all of these electronic sources of data, in order to derive meaningful data, we really need to get the data directly from the source. We need to get it in a timely fashion, meaning real time, and it has to be in context. And I want to explain why that's important. First of all, source of data is obviously critical. We talked about EMRs and EHRs a little bit, and the context of the data is also super critical. And the reason for that is whenever you go and retrospectively look at data, you have lost the context, meaning that there might be certain salient pieces of information that you do not have that are really necessary for you to have. So having the data come as it happens and as it's being collected enables you to also capture that context. And also, we all know, on average in the industry, from the time that a visit takes place until the data actually appears in an EDC, I've read articles where they say it takes anywhere from 21 days. And really, that's not acceptable. We go out of our way to have online supply chain systems. We do ePro so that the patient can tell us immediately about, let's say, pain levels and so forth. So that lag has to be eliminated. So what I'd like to do is spend a few slides here with you and go over some of the things that you need to consider. And then finally share a case study with you that explains some of the gains. But basically, interoperability is a prerequisite for any sort of effort, including risk-based management. So how do we bring the data together for analysis? Well, the good is that we are now very much electronic. We come across studies here and there that are still using paper, and we see healthcare practices that still use paper charts for patients. But increasingly, everything has gone electronic. But then with that, there has been this plethora of systems. By one account, by the time a given data element has gone through the clinical trial process, it has been touched by some 20 to 30 disparate systems. And that's really not hard to believe. If you think about all of the core labs that you utilize, the CRO's role, and the statistics group within the sponsor, and then the back and forth that goes on, it is pretty believable. So the more electronic systems and point solutions that we have introduced, we have more contributed to this fragmentation of data. These days, everybody uses EDC and CTMSs and safety, and as I mentioned, ePro. And then when you take that and multiply it by the partners, you really have a lot of them happening. Another challenge that has emerged is as these tools evolved along separate paths, development trajectories by different vendors, there is increasingly a lot of overlapping features. So you find CTMS systems that have certain data capture capabilities. You have EDC systems that show visit progress, for example, and data capture progress. That's really been an artifact of vendors being dutifully responsive to the needs of their clients and adding these feature functionality. But the problem is, now that you can get the data from multiple sources, how do you reconcile that? Which one is, as I call, the database of records? So that's one of the things you should think about, is which one of your electronic tools has the authoritative data on what you want to report on. And you'll be surprised, because once you do that survey, you will find that there is a great deal of overlap. So this inventory is really critical. What are the tools that you bring into play for your study? And then what are the data elements that are there that are vital for risk analysis or just normal operation, and where do they come from? And unfortunate thing again is that an EDC, for example, really does a good job of data capture and managing endpoints and deriving data from that. They tend to get progressively weaker when it comes to things like supply chain, depot management, and project management. So you will always end up having to trade. In order, you need to be prepared to say, even though I have the same data in multiple sources, this is the one that I'm going to consider to be the authoritative reference for this. So I want to talk a little bit about, Nithya did a great job of explaining to us the overall process and how critical it is. And truly, we're all convinced, hopefully by now, that there is a great deal of science that goes into managing risk and analyzing risk. What I want to talk a little bit about here is the importance of where do we get that data from. So you've done your inventory, you now know what are your systems, and you know what your authoritative data sources are. And what you want to now do is you want to feed that in for the analysis, and you want to get the insights. So a couple of things you want to talk about. One is, or think about, obviously aggregation. So you need to be able to pull data in from multiple sources, and if at all possible, you want it to be real time. And the reason for that is we all used to be able to conduct trials very effectively using paper. Now that is really an extreme minority of the studies that are out there. We all use electronic, and we won't even think about anything other than that. This velocity increase in data collection, it now requires us to use real-time data. In other words, you'll be walking away from a huge benefit that you have if you don't insist on having the data real-time. And one of the challenges of that is the traditional way of data aggregation, which was extract, transfer, and load, does not work in those settings. So for actually, doing the decision factory part, or the risk monitoring step, now you need to be able to collect and combine data from the same sources, but different locations. So let me explain what I mean by that. If you simply want to solicit data from multiple sites, you will begin to notice that just international practices will begin to influence the way the data has been captured. My favorite example is something as simple as calculating body mass index. Unless every single site that you have in your study is using the exact same EDC and they're entering data in the exact same fashion, which usually is not the case, you will end up with data that is calculated in a different way. However, in order for you to get a harmonious result in your analysis, you need to make sure that all of that data is consistent. So in a extract, transfer, and load approach, where you get that comma delimited file from the sites, and you have somebody combine everything, concatenate it, and deduplicate it, and load it, you then have to now spend a lot of time to recalculate certain things. So you need to have some intelligence that you build in to the way that you collect data, and it needs to be beyond just recalculating columns in a spreadsheet. It needs to be clinical rules. You need to be able to have it conditionally look and say, okay, if this is coming from this site, I know they consistently do data this way, and then bring it over. So that harmonization of the data, do not underestimate that effort. That is really critical, requires some planning, and obviously execution before the first drop of data makes it into the ecosystem. And Nitya summed it up really well in his last slide. You know, we do all of this good stuff, and currently what happens is, and this is really not a knock on anyone's operations, this is just the state of the science. We all then resort to manual processes such as email, picking up the phone, calling somebody, or get up from the data management department and walk over to the monitoring department and give them a list of you know, fields and areas that they should look at, and if you're a project manager, the sites and the status where they are and so forth. So wouldn't it be nice if all of this data then could, the results of this analysis, when you've identified the KPIs that are not achieving, to be fed right back into the respective systems? What are the benefits of that? You, by automatically, for example, updating the CRFs, by automatically updating the visit status in a CTMS or the patient recruitment data, you're eliminating manual touching of the data, so the quality increases. Aside from the fact that you won't spend the time to transcribe the data, the quality increases. It's a lot easier in a audit situation, such as a vendor audit, if you're a CRO, to explain how automatically something flows from one point to the next, what are the clinical rules that it goes through, how it's massaged automatically, and then once you have the validation trail for that, you can then prove that there is consistency. And once you have consistency, you're in compliance here. And ultimately, having the monitors to-do list. Currently, what happens in a lot of the sites that we have seen, meaning a lot of the studies that we have seen, data management works on the CTMS tool, as does the project management gets on the EDC. They both collectively look at the safety systems, and then they potentially look at you know, the supply chain, and the list goes on and on and on. So you have an environment where you have each division now using tools that are really weren't made for their use in order to achieve this. So really, if you do this thing right, you will be able to have data management only focus on EDC, project management only sit in front of the CTMS, and then have the results and the to-do list for the monitors automatically emerge. So the data flow is really a must-have. In other words, you really can't operate effectively by getting more and more point solutions and contributing to this fragmentation. So taking into account how the data is going to be integrated and how the data is going to flow from one place to the next is really critical. And the other thing we recommend is consider doing this in a permanent way. I was at the SCDM last year, and SCDM is coming up, so hopefully we'll be able to visit some of you. At the SCDM last year, the keynote speaker talked about the need for integration and interoperability, and the anecdote that he used, or rather the analogy, was he said our world today is like somebody wanting to place a call from New York to San Francisco, and that they proceed to put in the telephone poles between the East Coast and the West Coast, then they string the wires on, then they pick up the handset, make a telephone call, and then once the study is done and the call is over, they actually disassemble everything, roll up the wires, and then the next study we do the same thing. Well, the reason for that is because protocols are unique, studies are becoming more complex. But that doesn't really have to be done that way. If we design our data flow using an intelligent tool, then it'll be like having the intelligent telephone system that allows us to have any sort of a conversation over that backbone and framework. So in summary, practices that served us very well, which was extract, transfer, and load, and point-to-point integration. And a lot of us, would have the luxury of having access to many programmers. These things are no longer scalable. If we really want to glean benefits and use some of the sophistication that Acuity brings to the table and other analysis tools bring to the table for RBM, we really need to address this whole data integration in a holistic way, and we need to use smart tools to do that. It's going to be costly. If we stay the course, it will be very inefficient, we'll never achieve real time, and it'll be error prone. Again, we have seen cases where for every study, CROs might run out and hire a whole bunch of interns, and simply because the sponsor would like them to use a different tool, and now these interns have to just manually transcribe the data or babysit the data feeds and the data loads. So some quantifiable improvements. This goes beyond RBM. Basically, we did a case study. This was 3 actors here. There was the sponsor who was interested in getting interim feeds of the data from a CRO who had outsourced quite a bit of the work to a core lab. This was in particular an imaging core lab. So as you can well imagine, there were many systems that were touching the data that were coming from all different directions. Project management had the obligation at the CRO to aggregate everything and build the to-do list for the monitors. By using an interoperability platform, what we were able to do was, first of all, we maximized the reuse for the EDC. So what they were able to do was they were able to use the same templates and blueprints from one study to the next without worrying about the data handoff. Sometimes we have seen that people actually change their CRFs because the data handoff requirements are sometimes different. In this case, they didn't have to do that. They were reusing everything verbatim. If you accomplish that effectively, then you reduce your study setup time. Again, because you're not going through and tweaking the plumbing, as I like to talk about it. All you're doing is you're just looking at the protocol, you're concentrating on the CRF design, you're concentrating on the visit structures, you're concentrating on the flow of the compound from various depots. We showed that we halved the effort involved in data management. They were spending quite a bit of time reformatting data and combining it. We all know pivot tables in Excel. I will speak for myself. This was not a skill I picked up because I wanted to. This was a skill that I had to pick up because that was the way we did data manipulation. So we really want to do away with that. And source data verification, hopefully more and more e-source that comes out, less and less source data verification. However, if we continue to do data integration point to point, that is going to be something that we have an obligation to present to the auditors that we have double checked everything. Something that's not here that I want to talk about was in this particular case, there was 25 project managers and they were spending 1 day a month just massaging the data and cleaning it up for submission to the sponsor. So the sponsor had to wait once a month to get the data feed, project management, 26 man days, and that was all eliminated by just having a fluid interchange of data done. So that's a significant. And finally, wouldn't we all like to have an extra 27% of our day back so that we can catch up with the real work that we have to do? And truly, I believe state of technology has gotten to the point where through interoperability, we'll be able to get some of those benefits. And thank you very much for your time. If you have any questions, put them in the chat window, and I'm going to hand it back to you, Jason and/or Mitch.
Yeah, thank you, Sina. This is Mitch. Just encourage members of the audience, if you have questions, you can see the, please submit them now through the chat box. If you'd rather not submit a question publicly, or you want to flush it out in more detail, by all means do. You see the contact information there. We'll get back to you right away. And once again, thank everybody for setting aside time. As I said, we did have a large audience today, and we're glad to answer any questions and get back to you with follow-up as necessary.
And I want to personally thank Sina and Nithya for your insight. Thank you for your moderation, Mitch, as well. We do have one question that we can answer if you are able to give some insight. The requester asks, according to ICH E6 R2 section 8.1, the sponsor should ensure that the investigator has control of and continuous access to the CRF data reported to the sponsor. The sponsor should not have exclusive control of that data. They were interested in knowing if and how clients that we've supported or sponsors, consider, what do they consider compliant according to that statement?
Yeah, that's a great question. With respect to, so I focus predominantly on section 5, which is the risk management area. But to this question, when we talk about remote or central monitoring, there are tools available where you can still scan the CRF, but the elements that are not to be exposed to the sponsor can still be kind of masked in those tools. That way, only certain data points that are captured in the EDC and that needs to be visible to the sponsor alone is available as part of those masked CRFs. If you use those kind of tools, you will still be able to have continuous access, but can only see elements that are captured in CRF, in electronic CRF, and still have the paper CRF masked. So one of the EDCs that I know which has got this option is Omnicom. They have a module which allows you to scan the CRFs, but it still keeps the elements which are supposed to be masked, protected from the sponsor.
Excellent.
Other than that, you can't do that remotely because once you scan a page, everything is going to be visible to the sponsor, which the sponsor should not have access to.
Great. Well, thank you, Nithya, for that clarity, and thank you for the individual who submitted the question. If you have additional questions with regards to that or want to go deeper, as explained before, the contact information is on the screen here. We'll keep it up for a few moments to be able to have all those that have inquiries be able to address those, and we'll do so in a timely manner. One other individual asked about this webinar, whether the slides will be available. Indeed, the slides will be made available to all those who attended, and including the recording of the webinar itself for you to be able to use and hopefully be able to glean from for the improvement of your clinical trials. So with that, I'll conclude this webinar. Thank you, everyone, for joining. Thank you for your time, and please know that you'll have that follow-up email regarding the slides and the recording, and look out for future notifications of informative webinar sessions that we'll be holding for you to improve your clinical trial practices. With that, we wish you a great day, a great evening, and success in your compliance with ICH E6 R2. Take care.